All right, well, hello everybody, and thank you so much for coming to today's talk about interface transitions. If you want to follow along on Twitter, we have the hashtag UIFlow, and so you can write thoughts there, and we'll be definitely checking it out after the presentation. Just to give you an overview of what we'll talk about today, we're going to introduce ourselves to you. We'll talk about what are interface transitions and why you might want to be using them. We're also going to break down different types of transitions and discuss some points where maybe transitions go wrong. And then at the end, we'd like to provide some guidelines around how you might think about applying interface transitions in your work. And then we'll leave some time at the end for Q&A. So my name is Chandler. I am an interaction designer from the San Francisco Bay Area. I work with a small consulting group called Deep Dive Design in Silicon Valley, and we basically do consulting work with small and large companies from the Valley, and I've been there for around 4 years. And before that, I was at eBay for 5 years doing UI design.
Hi, my name is Jorge, and I'm a lead designer at HTC in Seattle. Before that, I was a designer at Sony Ericsson, now Sony Mobile. So I've been doing mobile interaction design for the past 5 years or so. Before that, I had the chance to work for a year and a half or so at IDEO. And since I see my former managers in the room, I'm going to say that both Sony Ericsson and HTC phones are great. Before we jump directly into the main topic of interface transitions, I would like to tell you a small story I have that might help to start this conversation in a more friendly tone. So some years ago, I had the opportunity to go back to Mexico City and take my wife there. And my wife loves architecture, especially she loves the work of this Mexican architect called Luis Barragán. He was, I think, the second person ever to receive the Pritzker Prize, I think in the 80s. And we had the chance to visit one of his last works. It's called the Gilardi House. And it was very interesting because you will enter the house. The house in the outside looks like just a regular house, but all pink. But once you enter, there was this really interesting hallway pointing towards the main room in the house. And there's a couple of interesting things going on here. The first one is that there's a lot of color in this hallway, but it's actually all white. It's just a play of light that is going on with the walls, and you see some yellowish tones and whatnot. And the second interesting thing that's going on is the fact that there is like a very strong visual element at the end of the hallway. So the hallway is kind of preparing you, is directing you to this, which is the main room of the house. This is a proof that, one, I have been to Mexico and to this house, and B, that I have a wife. And, and what is interesting is that you go all the way through this hallway, and you end up in this room, which is, for some time, it was very famous in some architecture magazines. It's an indoor pool that plays really nicely with light and allows for some really nice photos. But the main takeaway that I wanted to share with you about this is how, in this case, there is a very nice transition between the exterior of the house and the main room inside, and the transition itself helps to create the impact of the main room, which is this one.
So Jorge just showed an example from the world of architecture about how there's kind of a corollary transition that comes into play there. And so I thought it'd be fun to look at some other fields before we dive into the product space that we're all very familiar with. And so to begin, if we think about the world of film, the idea is that in this space you have this concept of an establishing shot. So if you watch this little preview, I want to show you a clip. And so first this is going to be without the establishing shot. So if you see what's going on.
I had such a dream last night.
So he's basically kind of climbing this tree and then lying out at the top of the tree. And so now I'm going to show the same thing, but with the establishing shot. And it's just a little brief thing that's been introduced. And that's it. That's the only difference between those two scenes.
I had such a dream
But if you see like how much has changed in terms of the way that maybe you feel about what you just saw. Whereas before, here's a guy who's maybe by himself climbing a tree, like, and what's he feeling, how's he thinking? But now, with that establishing shot, you know he's not alone. He's in a park or where there's other people and a swing, there's kids running around, and suddenly the context is really different. And so this idea of the establishing shot in the film world is a similar kind of thing like the hallway we talked about, where it's sort of setting and controlling and managing the expectations that the viewer has as they move from one point in the story to the next. In the next area, I wanted to shift gears into classical music. And so for this part, what I wanted to do is play you a little bit from Beethoven 3. And first, I'm going to start with the beginning so you can kind of hear how the opening is from the first movement. So it's this kind of slower, very serene scene where you've got the oboe playing and it's kind of, there's this calm element to it. But little do you know, only moments later into the movement, you're going to be right in the middle of this. So how on earth do we get from this one scene where everything's like very nice and calm, and then we get to there where everybody's playing faster, and there's the timpani playing, and everybody's, it's very raucous kind of scene. So how is it that Beethoven manages to get us from this one place to this other place? And what I'm going to play for you now is this transition he puts into place. And the reason why I think this is a really cool example is that he almost stretches out this transition intentionally, being like, you see what I'm doing here? You see what I'm doing here? Like you'll notice that it's kind of almost comically enhanced, this transition that he puts between these two different themes. So now we're at the right tempo, but we need to kind of get to that other stage. And here we are. So you can see the corollary example in the classical world, how Beethoven is managing to, do this transition for the audience to go from these different moods and different moments throughout the pieces. And this is not unique to Beethoven. You'll hear this in all sorts of different classical pieces. In the next part, and I apologize because I know this is before lunch, but I wanted to show you another example of this transition concept, but from the culinary world. And so I went out to Valentine's Day dinner with my fiance recently, and one of the things that they had were these amuse-bouches. And the idea here is that between your meals or in the beginning, before you start, you can use these things as a way to kind of set the context for the palate appropriately. The idea being that if you start with one appetizer and then you go into your entree, you don't want to shock the palate as it goes from one to the next. And so you can introduce these things as something to help transition your palate from one course to the next. And then the last example I wanted to show was from the world of dance. And the idea here is that in the dance environment, they will plan out this kind of choreography, and they know these key moments that they want to have happen. And then there's this question of like, well, how are we going to get from one stage to the next? And so what you're going to notice as I play this is that the arrangement kind of will change, and the way that they manage to get from one layout to the next. So here they're in this kind of layout, and then notice how they get out of the way, so this one guy in the center can do his head spin. Boom, they get out of the way, and now this guy needs to be there to be the focus of attention. And then you'll see again they need to change so that they can get all lined up again. Boom, now we're in another layout. So you can see how they're kind of using these transitions throughout their dance number. Okay, so we've looked at some of these other spaces, and so we should probably bring it back home now to talk about our world and the idea of product design, and specifically in interface design. And so in a similar vein, I wanted to show you a couple of examples. And so what I'm going to show is a very simple thing where essentially somebody is bringing up a bookmark on a map, and they're going to go look at that location. So I want to show you two examples of this. Here's the first one. So I touch the bookmarks, select it, and there they are. Now I'm going to show you a video of the exact same thing, but slightly different, and I want to see if you can tell me what the difference is. By this time, you're a little bit primed, so I'm hoping you can tell me. All right, can anybody tell me one or two differences, or how many? What are one of the differences between the two? Anybody? The drop-down? Right, so in the bookmarks list, if you can notice, as it moves up from the bottom of the screen when you hit the bookmarks come up from the bottom. Anybody see another point that's different? Yes, the pin just sort of like falls down from the top of the screen. And so these are a couple of elements, and in this very simple interaction that includes a couple of interface transitions. Now, basically what I would define this as is the interface transition is an event that takes place between two states of an interface. So if you have one state, so in the previous example, you've got a map, and then in the next state, you've got the list of bookmarks, there's this interface transition that's been put into place to get you from one state to the next.
But why use interface transitions? Like, as some of you know, guys, software development can be crazy. And when you add the design component into it, it's even more crazy. So why do it? Why even bother? And I think when we were preparing this talk, we tried to go through a number of good ideas of why adding transitions can help our projects and our products. And one of the things we thought is, well, interfaces are meant to be tools, right, to support certain activities. And just like the tools we use in the physical world, a polished transition adds perceived value to these tools. This sounds a little bit too academic, but I think we managed to get a good example of this happening in the real world. And I'm pretty sure that if you are either into design, into cars, or into products, this is going to resonate with you guys. The first example, we have these two handles, right? And they look pretty similar. Gray injection molding plastic. The shape is also a little bit similar. So, but at this point, we cannot establish like anything too different from each other. But what happens when we actually use these things? So you see in that one, the movement was actually a little bit violent, right? You will let it go and it will just go back, and there's also like some sort of sound, right? Because it goes so fast, it just like clack, snaps on top of it. But what happens on the second one? The volume level is the same in the videos, but as you can see, even the motion that the handle had was slightly different, right? It felt a little bit more controlled, and there was no sound, right? There was no this sign of violence, so to speak. And it's a very interesting thing because it speaks also of the quality of the vehicles and the brand itself. The first example was a Toyota car. The second was an Audi. So this polishment of the transition is part of the brand and the quality of the experience. A second point that we discussed for quite some time was that motion actually helps us to understand when something works. It helps us to understand when something is normal, is broken, or if the behavior of a website or an application is laggy or responsive. And during one of our brainstorms to go through the paper and present this, we stumbled upon a very interesting concept that I remember I read some years ago. It's called akinetopsia. I don't know if you ever have heard about it, but it's a very interesting condition. It's basically when people suffer some damage in their brain cortex and they stop perceiving motion. So the concept itself of course, it's sad, is a disorder, but the condition itself, it's for an interaction designer or somebody that is into user experience. It's very interesting to explore, or at least to have an overview on. And I managed to get a video that kind of tries to explain the general concept of akinetopsia. And I think that after you see it, you're going to start linking some of the values that we're talking about for interface transitions. So as you can see, it's very interesting, right? Because something that we usually wouldn't even realize, as long as we remove the transitions, the smoothness of these transitions, it's quite evident that something is wrong. And that links to my third point, which is that these transitions, obviously, they help us shape our reality, but when applied to interfaces, they help us to create this suspension of disbelief, right? Like we actually manage to convince people that what they are looking at is something else other than a bunch of pixels and processes.
So I have a story specifically around this, and it relates to the iBook design for the page turn effect. And so Apple put obviously a lot of love and care into really getting this effect of the page turn down in the animation when you paginate through a book. And my experience I had with this was that I was in a park in San Francisco, and I had my iPad, and I was reading a book, and I was kind of paging through it. And then all of a sudden, there's this gust of wind that blew up, and I instinctively put my hand on top of the screen because I didn't want the pages to blow. And I realized, like, oh my God, I'm going to see what Apple has kind of crafted. And it's really like what Jorge was talking about. Through that detail, they were really able to bring me into that world and suspend disbelief that this isn't actually a book. And I can, I was so involved in that it sort of made me react that way.
And so Jorge has actually spent a couple of years thinking about like a basic set of, like a basic taxonomy for transitions. And he has been discussing with me a couple of his ideas, and we agree that there's basically 4 transitions that we can start with.
Yeah, and I think one thing I always wanted to mention is that when I've looked around and seen a lot of the work that's already been done around this, a lot of it focuses in on the nuances of the execution of the transition, which I do think is really important, that you want to nail that. But what I wanted to try to do is to bring it up a little bit of a level higher to talk about these, what I felt like were a few different categories or different types of transitions that a designer might want to invoke for their own work.
And so, as he mentioned, his work is this work is mostly on trying to understand the different categories of transitions and how they can make sense to us. And I think that part of the interesting part of these categories is not to like memorize them, but try to understand some of the values of each transition style and how can we use them when we're facing a real project. The first one of these transition styles, we're calling it discrete, and it's basically that kind of transition that you oftentimes you don't even notice is there. And so the first time I'm going to show you, it's how the Chrome in a gallery interface just vanishes. And I want you to notice how there is a subtle actual vanishing effect rather than an on and off switch going on. So you can see how this person is just playing around with the video, and he's going to tap edit. And then there was a super subtle vanishing going on. The second example I want to show you is a multitasking launcher that we have for Sense 5 that we released a couple of weeks ago. And I want you to see how this person is going to trigger the multitasking screen, and not all the thumbnails for the different applications open are going to load at the same time. So if you could see, it was kind of coming from bottom right all the way up. And it's more noticeable when the full screen is filled with applications. But it's this kind of details that kind of soften the edges of our applications. Like that kind of stuff that you don't need to do, but it helps the perception you get of the application, right? Oftentimes, you know that one application feels more polished than another because of these little details where we skip a sudden jump or a rougher detail.
So in that example, the designer was kind of intentionally making these more subtle so that they are not, too burdensome and that it's more that it's kind of perceived at a subconscious level where it just sort of it feels like part of the design. Although people who do interface design are in the product world, and hopefully all of you after this presentation will see like now all these different little subtle effects that are imbued in all these things that we use. But in the next sort of type of transition, it's the opposite, where the intention was for the designer to create an effect that people are supposed to experience and enjoy. And so I'm calling these like a showcase transition. And so in this example, this is it from a video game, and I want to watch for this effect for when you reload. So if you noticed, basically when in this video game, when they ran out of ammunition, you could have just had it be reload and then immediately you have full ammunition again. But the designers kind of intentionally made it so that the guy had you saw he unscrewed it, twisted it, took it off, and then put this other thing on and screwed it back into place. And that was something that really people were supposed to perceive. Why? Well, there's a few reasons why. Like one is that this whole atmosphere of this game is supposed to be kind of feeling like steampunk, and that thing really helps to reinforce that feeling that you're in this environment, right? It's that it's less about being super high tech and digital, and I'm supposed to be trying to feeling like more the steampunk kind of environment. And then the other piece is that it introduces this gameplay element. And if you notice, when he was playing with somebody, fighting against somebody, he had to leave to go reload because the player knew how long it was going to take to do this thing, and so he actually goes away so he can do it and come back. And the idea is that time that's been introduced is supposed to be a gameplay element that the player is supposed to be painfully aware of. And the next example, this is one that we're probably all familiar with, is in the DVD world when you put in a DVD and load up the main menu and you see something like this where the main screen is loading into place, right? It's this kind of showcase transition, and then when I choose episode 1, you'll see that how the animation kind of, okay, and the navigation moves away and things fly off, and then now you put into place this next part. And that the designers for this put this into place because it helps to enforce that kind of Star Wars brand and make you feel like getting excited about watching this Star Wars movie.
The third type is something we're calling an educational transition, and it basically is a transition that provides a hint of how the system works. And these are, I think, pretty common, especially in mobile applications. The first example I'm going to show you is, again, from our latest release. We came up with a new keylog screen for Sense 5 and a new home screen that includes a feed, a content aggregator feed. And I want you to see how both of them are linked. First, you're going to see the log screen and how there is a clock component that has some sort of vertical motion. So I'm just going to let it play. And as you can see, once he pushed the clock to the top of the screen, the rest of the tiles, which are actually little items in the feed, came from below, right? They just follow in the vertical axis. What happens when you actually use the application? This is again, is just a content aggregator that pulls from different feeds and services, and it's time-based. So let's have a look at it. So as you can see, the initial transition from the log state to the active state of the application, it's providing you a very subtle hint like, hey, navigation is this way. And it's very useful because, as you can see, the layout of the application, there is no truncation of elements. So if you were to just open the phone and see this, it's kind of like, well, so should I swipe right, left, up, down? So the initial transition helps quite a bit. And the second one is a second example I want to show you for this one is a very challenging one because for Sense 5 we developed this capture mode called Zoe that is quite complicated in the background, so it's something difficult to explain for users. What Zoe does is that when you select this capture mode, the camera, every time you tap, it will capture 3 seconds of video and 20 burst shots of high quality. This is difficult to explain because until you experience it, it kind of starts like making sense. The reason why we decided to do this is because obviously when you have high screen images embedded in the video track, you can pinch to zoom and the quality of the zooming image is still really good. And you can have some editing tools afterwards. You can decide to remove objects from this image because there is a burst with information. But communicating this to the end user was difficult, or it's actually quite challenging. So what we came up with was this. You will turn on the capture mode, and as you press, you see that there is some work going on, and at the end there is a confirmation that you capture the whole sequence. And this one was particularly challenged because, as I was discussing with Corey, in our original sketches, we just had a big loading bar on top, and everybody that we tested the application with got frustrated because they thought it was processing time for the camera after you capture, which was not true. It was just a way for us to tell you that don't move the camera because it's still capturing.
So this segues into the next type, which is the idea of a processing interface transition, which we're all pretty familiar with, where the idea is that it's supposed to essentially articulate and ideally kind of mask the amount of time that it takes to process something. And the typical example of this that you'll see is in a loading screen, which we all are kind of familiar with. But what's interesting about this kind of transition, too, is that whereas the other transition types are things that the designer kind of intentionally puts into place, This is one of those things which, in an ideal world, maybe the designer would not like to put this thing into place, but because of the constraints of the system or whatever, they kind of have to put it in place so that, that the user realizes that things aren't really broken. And so the loading screen is one like kind of typical execution for this, but I thought I'd show an example which I thought was kind of neat from an app called Trevi, which basically will try to show where all of your photos are on a map. And so in addition to showing the typical like processing bar, what they try to do also, and like I was saying, masking the processing time, is to try to give you something to do other than just sitting there. And so part of the idea behind what they're doing here in that viewfinder is being able to let you essentially relive and reminisce over the photos that you've kind of taken before. So in this case, it's like, oh yeah, San Francisco, I have some photos there, and then, you know, oh, Mill Valley, that's like my hometown, and so there's some photos over there, and then, oh, that's right, I was in New York, and we had a lot of fun there, that was cool, and then like, oh, that's in Hawaii, I remember that too. And so they're trying to take you around the world and show you where these photos are. Meanwhile, it's working away and working away and working away trying to process all this stuff, but it's doing something to try to help soften that blow in terms of having to sit there and wait so long, and it's giving you something kind of interesting and compelling to do. So I've described all these things as separate concepts, but in reality, these things can definitely be combined together. And so as you see you can probably think of your own examples, and I have a couple here where you're combining two different transition types. And so in this case, I wanted to show the kayak example. And so you're going to see they're running a search, and when they do it, they show you this processing bar. And so it is kind of a processing transition, but it's also trying to be educational in the sense that it's telling you about all these places that it's looking, and to give you this sense of just how cohesive, like look how many different places we're looking. And you can also make the argument that maybe the designer might have also thought in mind that this is actually a showcase transition. Why? Well, the idea might be to say, I want to communicate to the user that we are this really heavy search engine, that we're doing all of this work, and if I just show all the results, I mean, that's not necessarily as amazing as if you really show something that's working away. It's like the Wizard of Oz with all the effects that are happening, like, wow, this must be really impressive. And so you might make the argument that they are intentionally kind of really showing how hard this thing's working for you, so that you have this added sense of perceived value in what Kayak is providing for you. Another example of a kind of a combined interface transition is the minimization effect from OS X. So it's educational in the sense that it's saying, this is where it just went, so you know where to go. But if you remember back in the day, when Apple released OS X, they were also really proud of the graphics processing capabilities. And so part of what they wanted to do was just show how much power this operating system had. And in fact, they were so proud of this that there's actually Easter egg. I don't know if you guys know, but if you hold down the Shift key and hit that minimization effect, it will super slowly show this effect happening. You guys can try it out. And it's like they were so excited about this that they even put that into place. And this is kind of an interesting one too, because there's actually a preference that you can set and choose what kind of interface transition you want for minimization. So we've described all of these different cases that show, nice attempts at introducing interface transitions into a system. But like any tool in the designer's toolbox, these things can definitely be misused. And so the one that we're probably most familiar with are the infamous shockwave introductions from the 90s and 2000s. And so here's one of these great examples. This is the introduction to this website.
I just want to say that if the designer of this is present, it's not personal.
Clearly somebody just went to a Flash seminar and was so excited, and they just really wanted to over-deliver. We'll be at the website soon, don't worry, almost there. It feels more like the introduction to a Bond villain's website than it does this, but at least the skip intro button is a little bit evident there. But so this is kind of an example of this transition introduction to an interface that has kind of gone awry.
But of course, this is let's say this is an old example, and as platforms and technologies and approaches to interaction design evolve, more recently, it requires more effort to actually find these like interfaces go wrong examples. There still are some around. This is a project that HTC developed a little bit before I joined the company. The first time they released the Windows Phone 7 devices, they created, because of Microsoft controlling very tight what is possible in the main interface, HTC decided to create a hub, which is just an application inside Windows Phone. And you are going to see the contrast between what Metro, the Windows interface, looks and feels and behaves, and the transition that occurs to enter our hub. And the first time you look at it, it's nice, right? It's something you're not expecting. You're entering into this hub, you see the clouds, 3D, jumping into your face and whatnot. But as you will see, this guy is exploring around the interface, and every single time he plans to go to a different section, he's going to be welcomed by a very rich transition. And the same is going to happen for every time he decides to change city or enter. There's even a demo mode in the application, so you can actually check all the different transitions and how the text jumps in, and when it's cloudy and when it's sunny. And this is an interesting case because at the time and after we released, there was both ways, right? There was people that thought it was too much, but there was people that really liked this. So it's difficult to get it right. And the critical component here was, and you're going to start looking at it in a second, is after he's just going through the demo of all the different transitions and different cities. And at the end of this exploration, he's going to start tapping back. And what the designers of this particular application probably didn't know is that the behavior of the back stack in Windows Phone, in the core platform, links the transitions to the back stack. So every time you tap back, you will have more clouds coming at every step. So enough, it's 2 more minutes of clouds. I'm going to spare you that. But as you can see, tap back, tap back.
So in the next example I'm going to show, I want to talk about the to-do list app Clear, and it's a really elegant and beautiful app. But one of the things that I think ends up happening with these types of applications that really try to dial back the UI Chrome, and I think that's a lot of why these kinds of things look so elegant, is that they've really pulled back on how much help and buttons and navigation there is and really try to let the app, the content speak for itself, is that from a user perspective, you end up really relying on what I was talking about before, these educational transitions. And so what I wanted to show you is, in this case, what's going to happen is he's making a new list of to-dos called travel. Okay, so we have 2 different to-do lists. And so what I want you to notice is that when you touch into travel, where the list of to-dos, like the 2 different kinds of to-dos go. So when he touches into it, boom, drops down to the bottom, right? So if I want to get back to that list of different to-dos to switch from travel to that other one, how do I get there, right? Well, it fell down to the bottom, right? So I should just be able to pull up to get it back, right? But in reality, the way that you get back is by pulling down from the top. And so this is a case where that transition ends up giving you this false information about how it is that you get back to this thing, which I said that problem is made even worse by the fact that there isn't any kind of UI, Chrome to help you figure this out. You're really relying totally on the gestures. And so basically we wanted to essentially try to articulate some guidelines that you might think of as you think about how might you apply interface transitions to your own work that you do. And the first one I was going to say is just basically it's a no-brainer to prototype these. And I think what's nice about it is that you don't actually have to build all of these to get a sense for how this is going to feel. Very simple tools like Keynote or PowerPoint are a great way you can manage to get the UI in there and then see how that effect kind of feels to give you a sense for whether that's a good direction to go in or not. So prototyping is a great idea for these things, obviously. The next part I was going to say is that any time that you've got a big change in the state of the system for the person, that is an opportunity that might be ripe for introducing some sort of transition to essentially kind of soften those edges out. And so, if you go back to that kinetopsia video, you know, when we were walking down that street and there's that kind of jolt that you see there, if you feel that kind of corollary happening in your own product, then this is something that is an opportunity for you to leverage interface transitions to help reduce that feeling and make the experience feel better. The other thing that's kind of a word of warning is that essentially, you know, the more often an interface transition is triggered, the more likely it should be discrete. And you saw this kind of happening with Jorge's example. And it's one of these things where if you've got something happening in your product that only happens every once in a while or very, very rarely. So for example, if you what should we do when the user deletes their account or something? Well, that only happens once, and so feel free to go to town if you want to with a transition. But if you've got something that people are doing all the time, like imagine unlocking your phone. If I, as a designer, was like, all right, I'm going to put some great transitions into place there, you can imagine how annoying that's going to get, you know, even though it's cool when you just show it maybe as a mock-up or as a one-time thing. But if you really think about how often this is going to be used, that should really be a word of warning to just really dial that back because of how frequently it's going to be invoked. This other point is kind of connected with the clear example, is that when you're introducing these kinds of transitions that people are going to notice, make sure you're not introducing false educational transitions. And so if you've got things that are, we can have it fly in from the side or from the bottom or something like that, it's like, well, okay, we could do that, but is that going to give a message to our users that isn't correct? As long as there is something to do in that direction, then great. But if not, you might want to consider a different kind of effect so you're not misleading your users.
And the last one is keep your canvas in mind. On purpose, I wanted to express this as a canvas because I didn't want to communicate the idea that there's constraints. Of course, there's always constraints, but as a designer, I think you need to try to see what your platform and your tools are capable of and try to squeeze the most out of them. We had a very interesting conversation because Corey, most of the time, is dealing with web experiences versus my own experience is more in mobile devices. And we start thinking about how interesting is the fact that, in his case, well, you need to think about performance, right? And browsers, and whether the connectivity is going to be good enough or not, versus a mobile device experience where we have all this local information traveling and jumping here and there. And what is important is to know what the core platform or the OS that you are using can support you and help you to do. There's a couple of interesting examples, like the Windows Home Video, right? Like the way they build the OS triggers the transitions more than the designer would like to. Something that used to happen some years ago was, I don't know if you remember, but the original notification system for the iPhone, if you had 10 notifications at the time, was a nightmare. And even so more because there was sound involved, right? So you will get like ad infinitum. So just keep those things in mind. Even if, I think it's good that there's so many devices and cheap development and prototyping platforms available that you can just grab a phone at Radio Shack and play around with a couple of applications and start looking into what the platform actually is delivering, rather than going through documentation. And
so that's pretty much it. And we're going to actually shift into Q&A at this point if you have any kinds of questions that you'd like to ask. And actually, the way to do it is that if you come to the front, there should be a couple of folks who have a microphone who can give you a chance to ask any kind of questions. But thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Hey guys.
Hi.
Thanks for speaking.
Yeah.
My question is, I've gone through making 2 apps, and both times in the process, the teams that I worked with wanted to save the designing the transitions till the end as like an afterthought. So in your opinion, from the very beginning in wireframes to the launch of the product, when should that start happening?
It's a good question, and I think the tempting answer that would be a cop-out is to say like, oh, from the very beginning. I mean, before you do anything, really think through your transitions. But I want to be realistic about really what your prioritization. You have so much that you need to do when you craft an experience. And so in my mind, I feel like this is the kind of thing that you can put into place once you've got some of the fundamentals of what you're working on figured out in terms of thinking about the architecture and sort of the general stages of things. The one exception to that I might make is that if part of what you are thinking about doing is something along the lines of Clear, where essentially having people understand how this thing works is so instrumental to the success of it, and part of essentially what is going to make this thing work or not from the get-go is around whether or not you can connect together these educational transitions. And that might be the one case where you might want to think through that more up front. But otherwise, I think there are so many other things that are really important to do up front that I would say that maybe it's better to work those out first and then consider the transitions a little bit further into the project.
Oh,
Yeah.
Hi. I know you mentioned that you work more with web and you do mobile. When it comes to responsive design, do you think it's important to take that in consideration? I know in a phone you can't make the screen bigger, but you can do it. You can do the opposite. You can use a computer and make the screen bigger. Mm-hmm. So do you think transitions are important in that situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it makes a lot of sense because you do want to consider the context that you're in, and I think that's one of the things that I'm still exploring is to understand, how much can everything about the experience be adjusted as you're aware of these different environments. I mean, I think responsive design is about kind of dynamically figuring this out, but it seems like there are some benefits to knowing, as a part of when you craft the experience, understanding that context, knowing, okay, well, if I'm in this environment, this kind of experience and this kind of transition makes more sense than if I'm in this kind of environment. So I do think that they're connected in this and that you should consider them in the same way that I think even though you are working in a flexible environment in responsive design where it's basically flexing from different, you are also thinking about these milestones in terms of thinking about mobile, thinking about tablet, thinking about the laptop, thinking about the TV or whatever environment, and so within those contexts, thinking about whether or not this transition is going to make sense.
Yeah, I think also something interesting to explore is like play with hybrid views for interfaces, for mobile interfaces. Like both Android and iOS have the concept of fragments and views. And it's interesting to play with whether just have one of the fragments being a web view where you refresh the content in a more natural way and integrate that with the local content. So I think it's actually very interesting, like where these two areas interface.
Hi guys, thank you for your talk. I was just wondering, are your slides with the examples available online to download somewhere?
It's a good, and we will put them up afterwards. I tell you what we'll do is we'll make them available for download, and then we will tweet the URL with the hashtag UIFlow so you can find it.
Okay, cool, thank you.
Yeah. Over here.
Hey guys, thanks.
Yeah.
I've been doing wireframes and mocks for years, but I've yet to find what the final deliverable to pass to a developer for a real nice animation guide is. What are you guys using for the final handoff?
Well,
You mentioned Keynote and PowerPoint, but that only goes so far.
I actually think that for the most part, I've been lucky because I've been in some really. I'm gonna talk good about Sony Ericsson here. Hey. So we had, for instance, there might be projects that are quite complicated. At some point, when we released the first line of Xperia phones, the revamp of the Android interface was very complex. And some of the applications, there was a content aggregator that was actually built in Maya. It was a 3D environment. And so what we did is we got help from very talented people on the After Effects side of things. And they help us to put together a file that the developers could reference to and read the cues. And something interesting is the fact that not many developers are into After Effects. So you need to be very thoughtful on how do you create your output for that transition. Like try to see the motion paths and whatnot and be very clear about it. And that's a very advanced stage, right? Like when we did that, it was coding time and hard time. But even before, as Corey was pointing, like Keynote is an amazing tool. Like just the magic transition. When you go to the rest of the visual and transition themes, just having this magic transition just to show the overall concept of how it's going to work, that helps a lot.
I think my thoughts on that too are that I think if you're lucky enough to work in a smaller environment, then that's really nice because you can really just sit with the developer and talk with them about it. And because I think when it comes to designing experiences, there's a degree to which we have a responsibility as designers to be able to foresee the future in terms of how this thing's going to work. But I feel like there's really in some cases where it's limited, where you kind of want to say, I think this will work, but I want to play around with it.
Yep.
And ideally, you want to try to work in an environment where that's okay, where they're happy to have you come and sit down and play and make tweaks, And so one thing, ideally, you work with a developer who really cares about this stuff. In fact, this presentation might be something that you can use to kind of get them on the same page in terms of getting excited about it. And then, so like with my current client, the developer is excited about this idea and is happy to kind of be playing around with it. And I can turn around and see what she's come up with, and she's excited to kind of make these modifications because it's also like it lets her be an artist to some degree, which was just nice because she can kind of get out of that box of just being just a pure developer as well.
Yeah, I've been lucky enough to have that experience, but that's not all experiences. So thanks.
Yeah,
thank you guys.
Over here.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. My question is really how far can you go with transitions? I mean, how skeuomorphic, if you like, can you make these things? I mean, your example earlier about iBooks with the beautiful page transition is obviously really nice. But my question is, how necessary is that, and how close should you map things to the real world? Because obviously it does look very beautiful and it's very pretty, but at the end of the day, you shouldn't feel like you need to stop all those pages from blowing in the wind because you're not dealing with the book.
Right. No, it's true. It's a good question. I mean, I think it's essentially part of the question of what you feel like the purpose is of what you're producing. Like, if part of the idea that you're trying to imbue in this is this feeling of being in this environment, and that's stated as like essentially part of maybe the goals from a design perspective or from a business perspective, that they're wanting people to kind of feel this way, versus whether you're in a different scenario, like that might be able to kind of curb your decision one way or the other. And I also think you don't want to necessarily be constrained by skeuomorphism into only using one kind of language, and that might be another argument against going that way, is to say that well, this is a downside of skeuomorphism, is that it kind of traps you in this kind of environment. Do you have any other thoughts around?
Yeah, don't get me started. No, I actually think that it's a very good point. I think that I was talking with a friend of mine, this guy called Mark Colleran, which is the guy that makes interface design for movies like The Island and whatnot. And we were having this debate about skeuomorphism, and he will tell me, well, it's not whether to do it or not, whether it's more like whether it's appropriate or not. And of course, that's one of the reasons why it's important to like first put the blocks of your application so you can understand what's the message that you're trying to communicate. Because if you are basing your experience in real 3D environment, then you're expecting like just the planning of that. If you have like a game, you're expecting that kind of motion, right? If you go for a more abstract approach, I think still there's no need for skeuomorphism per se, but I think like the work that Metro in Windows Phone is doing is very interesting because they still keep some spatial references. A transition that I think is very well achieved is every time you select something from the home screen and all the tiles fly away, but the last tile that flies is the one that you are going to access. So it's a way to tell you, hey, this is your destination. And so I don't think there is that skeuomorphism is bad or negative by itself, but if you take it out of context or you just go, it's like, is vanilla ice cream bad? Well, if you have like 3 gallons a day, it's probably bad, right?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just a comment about documenting. I used After Effects And the nice things about that is it actually allows me to figure out the exact timing, so I can turn around and say to the developer, this is going to be a 200 millisecond or a 300 millisecond transition. I'd also say I've also had a lot of success creating iconic representations, and you can get a lot of these from video editing programs because they, of course, do a lot of transitions. So just as a way of being able to document and share that with developers and communicate that.
Awesome, thank you.
Thanks.
So you talk about the theoretical framework of transitions being, going from one state in the user experience to another. And I was wondering if you've ever encountered places where that framework doesn't quite work, where maybe it's hard to define the actual states and actually because there's some experiences like, the video game you showed where it really is just sort of one thing flowing to another all the time, and it's hard to really sort of pick out the transitions, although you did find a good example. From my perspective, I'm actually working on a platform where I want people to be able to create great transitions. So I'm wondering, what is the scope where, how far do you go before that framework of thinking from one state to another breaks down?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and I think that even in cases where things are fluently changing all the time, I feel like there is still a way of kind of saying generalizations about the different states that somebody's in. So like in the video game point, like maybe that you can summarize it as well, if you're in this normal kind of combat mode, so you're walking around doing so and so, versus like, okay, well now actually they're flying a plane, and so that's a different kind of, it's changing all the time, but it's like this generic state that you're in, and so and then within that context you can still say that there are transitions that happen, to where you need to bring something to their attention, so I would imagine that those sorts of environments, or another example, we went to a talk from NASA yesterday, and I would imagine that that's another case where it's just there's kind of constantly things moving in different states of readiness, and it's very dynamic, and so I would imagine that would be another scenario where it's so fluid that it might be tricky to consider. But the good news is that I do feel like maybe from an overarching context that as humans we can only also handle so much that if we were in a world where so much about the core of experience was just changing all the time, then I think that in and of itself would be like a really challenging experience to have. And so inherently there's limitations from a human perspective around like what we can handle. And so because of that kind of inherent constraint, that still enables us to apply some of these tools.
Yeah. I think also that like the main difference there is a very interesting point is whether your application has more of a immersive approach, where you could think of it as the interface is more of an augmented reality component rather than the main item on screen. And so like for games, I could think that it's quite related and on the same path as what Google is doing with Glass, right? It's trying to present information in such a way that the transitions don't distract you from the main immersive activity. So in that case, I think that the framework we present is still valid, and it has more to do on the initial conceptual stage of your development cycle, where you say like, it's all about what's happening on the viewfinder, or it's all about what's this immersive experience, and these things are just providing extra information, so they shouldn't like just block the experience. And so I think it's more like the way you plan, and you can achieve very interesting results in that way.
Another one over here.
Hi, Matthew Bartle, interaction designer. So I know we touched a little bit on this with the kayak example, but as technology is constantly improving, loading times are not going to be needed. So I'm kind of wondering what you guys think of when to use sort of simulated loading times when it's could be potentially good for the user.
The case where you might want to use a simulated loading time might be in the scenario where you are trying to help set expectations for something, where maybe even though you have it ready to go, that you are trying to kind of explain some things, and so that might be a case where it might warrant it. But I think generally you should be very cautious to put those in place in cases where you don't really need them, or maybe it's the kind of thing that you only put in place at the initial stage, and so you'll see some examples of that, when people who try to do like introductions to new systems, where they'll try to explain that to you. I mean, and in fact, some video games you play too, when you first start out, in order to get you understanding how these things work, they'll start you with no context, and they'll say like, oh, well, this is like, you have like a certain amount of shields, and they're like, let's show you where that thing is. And then they could have just showed you it right away. It's not a processing issue, but it's more because they're trying to help you to understand this thing, that like they are trying to introduce it to you slowly. So that might be a case where if you find that people are just throwing people into an experience is actually detrimental, that maybe this is an opportunity for you to introduce something in place to help set that context right.
Yeah, and I think that it's still pretty valid on my point of view, because it's kind of a myth. Like, reality is that, I mean, there's very lucky cities like New York, Austin, San Francisco, Seattle, where you have like really nice internet services. But even so, just turn on Netflix in 2 rooms, and your performance goes down, right? So I think that it's good to keep in mind that we are not always playing with the best case scenario, just in the back of your mind.
Great. Well, I think that's all the questions. Feel free to come up afterwards if you have any others, but thank you all again for coming.
Thank you.